Okay, we're Pirkei, Mishnah Zion, chapter 5, the 7th Mishnah. It's interesting that the 7th Mishnah is the Mishnah that starts to talk about the number 7. So up until now, all the Mishnahs of this chapter spoke about things that are relevant to the number 10, and now we're crossing to the number 7. And what the two numbers do have in common is that they each represent complete systems. So the number 10, if you look at the examples of the things that we've learned that are associated with the number 10, you can understand that the number 10 speaks about the systems of creation itself. So the world was created with 10 utterances, and the entire structure of how the world works is a structure of 10 energies. So in Kabbalah we talk a lot about the idea of the 10 sephiros, that there's these 10 supernal energies that effectively run everything. And likewise we're told that the neshama comprises 10 koichas hanefesh, the 10 powers of the soul. So the number 10 is effectively, it is a number of completion, of a complete cycle, a complete system. But it's, if you wish, you could say that the number 10 refers to the number of, like the broader cycles, the greater structures, the superstructures of existence. The number 7, on the other hand, the number 7 you could say would refer to the smaller structures, in a sense almost the more personal structures. So for example, the structure of time is associated with the number 7, right? The 7 days of the week. So that implies that segments of time work in structures of 7. So you could say this. You could say existence is created out of 10 utterances because it's a 10-tiered structure. Inside existence, you have a subsystem called the passage of time. So that's a smaller system. The smaller system operates in 7s. Likewise, you could say about a person, this is going to be directly relevant to today's Mishnah, that the structure, the superstructure of the person, the soul of the person is comprised of 10 aspects, 10 facets. Whereas the character of a person, which is only one of the systems inside the human experience, right? Character is not the whole of the person, although we'll see that the Rambam has a particular view on this which is relevant to our conversation. You'll also see that the particular name that the Mishnah is going to use doesn't sound like a name that is associated with character specifically, but just at a high level we could say that the structure of the entire human being would be represented by the number 10, and the structure of the character and personality of the human being would be represented by the number 7, and that's a lot of what we're going to speak about today. What else you should just know before we begin is that today's Mishnah is a very useful Mishnah for engaging with other people. That's really what this Mishnah is all about. And engagement with other people could work in a number of ways. Regular conversation, teaching and learning, or debate. And it's what we're going to learn in this Mishnah is relevant to all of those. Okay, it will be relevant to regular conversation, it will be relevant to intellectual or academic conversation, and it will definitely be relevant to debate. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through these things. And essentially what we're going to discover is that the nature of a person's character and how they use their character will determine how they interact with other people in conversation, and particularly in difficult conversations, which is where the debate comes into it. Okay, so as we go through the various elements of this Mishnah, we should be thinking about that last difficult conversation that we had and how possibly we could do things a little differently based on the template that we're going to see in this Mishnah. Now, before we can begin this Mishnah, there are two words that are key to the Mishnah, and because this Mishnah is going to contrast two types of personality. Again, number 7 is a number that represents character or personality. So we're going to contrast two kinds of personality. We're going to call the one kind Chacham, and we're going to call the other personality. What's the opposite of a Chacham? Right? You'd say Tipeish, right? Tipeish is a fool, right? So Chacham is a wise person, and you'd assume that the opposite of a Chacham is a Tipeish, somebody who's not so wise. So then you'd say possibly the opposite should be ignorant, right? What's the Hebrew word, or I should say the Talmudic term for an ignorant person? Am ha'aretz, right? And Am ha'aretz is an ignorant person. And by the way, just for interest's sake, and not just for interest's sake, it is part of the conversation. What is worse than an Am ha'aretz? What is more ignorant than an Am ha'aretz? A bur, right? A bur, not the bur we speak about in this country, the one that Mark Kaplan. This is bur in the sense, well, we'll see exactly what it means, a bur. So you would think that the opposite of chacham is either Am ha'aretz, a person who is somewhat ignorant, or bur, a person who is altogether ignorant. And that's not the case. This Mishnah is going to contrast on the one hand a chacham, and on the other hand a goylem. Okay, what's a goylem? What's a goylem? So you may be familiar with the goylem of Prague. Yeah, you may be familiar. Basically, the goylem of Prague is a very interesting way to describe what a goylem is. So what's the goylem of Prague? Was what? Not a ghost. Man-made. Right? It was the first AI. Artificial intelligence, yes? Like the first robotic artificial intelligence and had a skin that really looked human, basically. I mean, it was made out of mud.
Sounds like a clone.
Like a clone, exactly. Like some kind of a robotic, or, I mean, it wasn't robotic, it was organic, but it was it was artificial. It was artificial intelligence, artificial being, a clone, whatever you want to call it. The bottom line is this: what could a goylem do? The goylem of Prague. What could the goylem do and what could the goylem not do? And as the story goes, we know there's certain things about the goylem. So what could the goylem do? What it was told to do. And you have to be really explicit and clear in your directions to the goylem, because the goylem could only do what it was told to do. Now, you might have somebody that you've employed at some point in your life who operated exactly like that as a goylem. You know, you've got to spell it all out, because if you leave anything to the imagination, it's not going to happen. You actually have to say, do X and Y, and that's how it was with the goylem. Now, one of the most important things about the instruction to the goylem, the story goes, that remember, when was the golem brought to life? What time of the year? Before Pesach. Because the Maharal, who was this great Kabbalist in Prague, he had to face this ongoing libel called the blood libel, which was very common. In those days, it was common in Europe. Today, you really only hear about the blood libel in Arab countries. But it was the accusation that the Jewish people slaughter a child in order to use the blood in order to make matzahs. And as a result of that, there were pogroms against the Jews. So the idea was to create this golem who would then patrol the Jewish community of Prague and make sure that they couldn't plant the body that was always used to accuse the Jews of killing a child for the matzahs. So he was made just before Pesach. The legend goes that when the golem was introduced to the family, it wasn't like, hey everybody, this is the golem that we just made last night on the riverbank. But he was introduced as if he was a guy who just landed up in town, needed a place to stay, and is actually very handy, so he's going to help the community. And his name is Yossel, right? Yossel the Goylem. And one of the things that the Maharal, according to the legend, told his wife is, you can't use the Goylem for personal errands. You can only use him for communal affairs. And of course, you know what the pressure is like on Erev Pesach. In those days, we joke over here about water. In those days, they didn't expect that they'd have water for Pesach. I know it's a scary thought, but they didn't anticipate that they'd have water for Pesach. You had to go to the well, and you had to draw water from the well and put it into some kind of a barrel. So the legend goes that she was feeling desperate, the Maharal's wife, and asked the golem to go and fill up the barrel with water, which he did. The only thing is, the instruction did not include what you do when the barrel is full. So he just kept getting water, and the next thing was a flood. Of course, possibly the only thing worse than no water on Erev Pesach would be a flood. So that's what lands up happening. So what is a golem? A golem is basically an individual who is, well, you could easily translate the golem as somebody who's quite dumb, but that's not the point. That's not what a golem means. A golem means something that is unfinished. So it's not fully functional. That's what the golem is. Not fully functional. What else about the golem? There was one other thing the golem was unable to do. Very familiar. Couldn't speak. The golem was unable to speak. So when he was introduced to the family, it was this mute who had come into town, and everybody just accepted that because he did seem a little bit, shall we say, challenged, right? So why is it that he couldn't speak? Because only Hashem can grant speech. We know that from Moshe Rabbeinu, Mi Sam Pela Adam, that Hashem says to Moshe, who gives humans the ability to speak? Only I, Alo Yonochi Hashem. A human being, no matter how great, no matter what kind of a Kabbalist, cannot imbue somebody with the power of speech. So therefore he's a golem. There's a whole chunk of humanity missing from him. So that's the implication of a golem. A golem is somebody who has a chunk of humanity missing from them. Outside of human terms, a golem is a piece of clay before you fashion it into a particular item. That's called a golem, right? David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Golmi ra'u einecha, that your eyes, Hashem, you saw me when I was still unformed. That's what David is saying. In other words, that Hashem predates the human being. So you saw us when we were still unformed. So a goylem is somebody who is unformed. The Rambam says something interesting about this. He says that in order for a person to be a complete human being, the person has to have mastery in two key areas. To be considered like a real, ideal human, you have to have mastery in two areas. What are the two areas? The intellect and character. So a person who has mastery in both intellect and character, that, says the Rambam, is what we call a chacham. Which is interesting, because classically we would have thought that a chacham is just a matter of IQ. Chacham is a wise person. So we would assume, typically, that a chacham is just somebody who has mastery over the intellectual. So the Rambam is telling us something which is very interesting, that in order to qualify as a chacham in Judaism, it is critical to know that in Judaism, intellect alone is not considered an accolade. We don't give somebody credit just because they're smart. You have to master the intellectual and you have to master character, and then you could be considered a chacham. By the way, just for interest's sake, the Rambam then says, and if a person masters intellect and masters character, only when they reach the point that they go beyond their mastery and they start to add even more, as he calls it, zchus, like more virtue to their life, then we call that person a chassid. So the definition of chassid is somebody who's gone beyond just personal mastery, that they're now obviously engaged with making a difference to other people as well. So the Rambam says the definition of a bur means, there's actually an expression in agriculture, in the Talmudic expression for agriculture, which is called sedei bur. Sedei bur means an empty field, as opposed to sedei ilan. What's the difference? So if you've got trees, even if it's out of season and there's no fruit on the trees, you still have a field that is filled with trees. Sedei bur is a field that hasn't yet been cultivated, and when it will be cultivated, it will turn into what we call sedei lavan, which is basically a field of produce. So even if there isn't produce growing in the field, you can see that there's furrows, you can see that this is a place that is used for produce. So bur means it hasn't been worked at all, hasn't yet, it's wild, it's a wild field. So the Rambam says that a bur is somebody who has no mastery, hasn't even begun the journey of mastery over intellect and mastery over character. That's a bur. That's about as lowly as a person could be. Whereas an am haaretz, he says, is a person who at least has some character even though they're ignorant. So intellectually they're stymied, but at least they have some character. A goylem, he says, is even better than an am haaretz. A goylem is somebody who has begun the process of trying to work on becoming a better person, but they're a long way from their objective, and therefore we can compare them to a chacham. If somebody isn't yet on the journey, you can't compare them to a chacham. That's ridiculous. Why would you compare somebody who has no virtue to somebody who has so much virtue? So that's why in the Rambam's view, this idea of a goylem is specifically somebody who's already made some developmental progress, but is so far away from their objective that we need to contrast them with a chacham. In other words, the Mishnah only has to tell us the distinction between two people if we wouldn't obviously make that distinction. So if somebody's a bur, we would never think, what's the difference between a bur and a chacham? You would know, because the bur is an empty vessel and the chacham is an outstanding human being. So with that in mind, now let's have a look at what these 7 things are that are going to distinguish the chacham from the goylem. Okay, so the Mishnah says, Shiva dvarim b'chacham. There are 7 things that indicate a wise person. Shiva b'goylem, and there's 7 that indicate this unfinished person not quite where they should be. So number 1, he says, the very first thing we learn is, Chacham einoi medaber lifnei mishu gadol mimenu b'chachma v'minyan. A chacham is wise enough to know that before you begin speaking, remember, this is the Mishnah that's going to tell us about how to engage verbally, how to have conversations, how to have academic conversations, and how to have debates. So the first thing that the chacham knows is when to speak at all. Chacham einoi medaber lifnei mishu gadol mimenu b'chachma v'minyan. The chacham, the wise person, will not speak in front of somebody who is senior to them. Okay, so how do you know? How do you know if somebody is your senior? Says the Mishnah, b'chochma or v'minyan. There are two possible ways that you can work this out. Either you have to look at how wise the person is, so you don't speak in front of somebody who is wiser than you, or you don't speak in front of somebody who has minyan. How do you translate minyan? And please don't tell me 10 men. How do you translate minyan? No? What? That's what I said. Not 10 men. What is minyan? See, this is a funny thing. Counting, exactly. This is a funny thing. We default to the fact that minyan means 10 men, but actually the term minyan means to count. So there's obviously something that is measured by knowledge or wisdom, and there's something that is measured by number. So let's think about this for a second. If we're talking about an individual, what would we number in order to decide whether they are age, right? Senior, that's what I'm saying the word, right? So minyan, the simplest would be to say, you don't speak in front of somebody who is older than you. That's the first thing. A chacham knows that you don't speak in front of somebody who is older than you, even if they're not wiser than you, which is interesting. One possibility. And we have precedent for that. By the way, the Gemara tells us that Rabban Yochanan, he would give respect to older people even if they were not Jewish. Because in Judaism, the fact that somebody is older than us already means that we have to treat them with a certain element of respect. So a chacham is wise enough to know that, you know what? Age brings experience. So perhaps the person isn't as academically strong as I am, but the fact that they have lived longer than I have, that means that they have greater insight in certain things than I have, right? There's no alternative to experience. I remember many years ago, there was a rabbi visiting here from overseas, and he was a pretty large individual, and we were in high school at the time, and it was in the December holidays, and it was like a yeshiva program for the high school boys. So we're sitting in this yeshiva program with bochrim from the yeshiva, and this rabbi was there, and he had a conversation which turned into a debate between some of the bochrim and himself. I don't even remember what the topic was, but they were having a debate. And I'll never forget, at some point he said to this bocher, who was very, bochrim can be quite passionate, shall we say. So this bocher was really passionate about his viewpoint. And this rabbi at some point said to him, with all due respect, he says to this guy, he says, with all due respect, I may not know more than you, but I have eaten more cholent than you. and effectively what he was saying is, obviously he knew more. That was obvious. It was a very scholarly individual, let me tell you. But the point he was making really is that it doesn't matter if I don't know more than you do. I'm older than you do. And, there's a way that you do and that you don't talk. It was like a beautiful moment. He said in this self-deprecating way, I've eaten more cholent than you have. Which basically means I've been around longer. So chokhmah and minyan could mean the amount of years. You count how many years. In other words, if the person is older than you are, then you have to defer to them, or at least you don't speak in front of them. You don't preempt. We're about to go into Purim. Who is the classic example of a goylem? Because remember, we're going to see at the end of the Mishnah that a golem is the opposite. We haven't got there yet, but the Mishnah is going to tell us the golem is the opposite. Who's the classic example of a golem? Somebody who dafka speaks in front of those who are their senior. Haman. That's how Haman gets into the book in the first place, because when Achashverosh is looking around to work out what to do with Vashti, because Vashti refuses to come and appear in front of everybody at the meal, nobody wants to take responsibility to give him advice that they know is not going to end well. There's a guy, Haman, puts up his hand and he says he's the junior out of all the advisors, but he's got a plan, he's got an idea, and that's actually how Haman gets himself into his position, into his role.
Doesn't talk.
Yes, I know, but I'm saying that a goyla made by the Maharal doesn't talk, but
okay.
You know what they say? They say that there was I don't know who it was, there was a particular rabbi who had a yeshiva, and he said, I don't see what the big deal is that the Maharal of Prague produced a goylem. He says, I've been in my yeshiva for many years, and I've produced many golems. So it's not necessarily a factor only of not speaking, right? A golem means somebody who's not, not developed.
But also in terms of counting, like the majority rule.
Good. Okay. Okay, very good. So minyan, not necessarily the majority in a particular case, but look how many people follow this individual. So minyan could be, you count how many students. Do they have more students than you have? Then you defer to them. Because there's a reason that they have a following. There's a reason that people go to learn from them. And that ties in with another view of chokhmah. How do you measure chokhmah? What is there? Do you make the guy take an IQ test and then you decide whether you're going to speak in front of them or not? So one of the interpretations of chokhmah, I think it's the Yochin, if I'm not mistaken, who says it, is chokhmah is how many published scholarly articles does he have? Or in our context, how many piskei din, how many halachic rulings have been ruled in favor of this particular individual. So that would be how you determine chokhmah. So the first lesson is the chokhmah is not to speak in front of a person who might be superior to you, either in wisdom or in the number of years or the number of students. Now we have precedent for this. The precedent is, and we're going to see two of the examples in the Mishnah actually come from the same story. The precedent is that at the time when Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, died prematurely and tragically, so there was a little bit of a debate between Moshe and Aaron as to Aaron's conduct after they passed away. And the other two sons, Elazar and Isamar, were standing there and they had an argument to support their father, to be able to defend Aaron's behavior to Moshe, but they didn't say anything because their father was there and he was obviously older than them and wiser than them, so they allowed him to give the response to Moshe instead. So that's actually where we learn it from. So what's the lesson over here? It's fascinating. The idea is that a chacham, you can see straight away, chachma is not a matter of how smart somebody is. In fact, quite a number of the Mefarshim point out that it is possible that the chacham is actually smarter than the person who's older or even has more students. Could be more what we call charif, which means that they're switched on. So it's not a measure of wisdom. It turns out that chacham is a measure of humility. Actually, that's the first lesson we're learning over here. And this ties in, if you remember, in the 4th chapter, when we had the Mishnah that says, Eizehu chacham, who is a chacham? Aloi made me kol adam, somebody who is able to learn from everybody else. That implies that chachma is rooted in humility. It's rooted in character more than it is rooted in intellect. That's a very insightful principle. Okay, so now that's the first step. The first step is before you start the conversation, know whether or not you should speak in front of this particular individual. Let's assume that it is appropriate to speak. Well, now we come to the next lesson. What's the next lesson? Which means you don't interrupt the other person. You don't interrupt the other person when they're speaking. Now, if you talk about a regular conversation, sometimes it happens that people speak over each other. It's not the end of the world. But this is extremely likely in the case of debate. Because if you have two opposing views, it is the most normal thing for a person to rush their view before they've heard what the other person has to say. So, a chacham eino nichnas ledivrei chaveroi does not interrupt what the other person is saying. Now, can you think of an example of anywhere in Tanakh where we learn this principle that you should not interrupt what somebody else is saying? Do you think of an example? Either you have one off the top of your head, or it's unlikely that you'll know which one the Mishnah is referring to. Believe it or not, the example of this comes from Hashem speaking to Aaron and to Miriam. Okay, what was the story? Remember, Miriam spoke negatively about Moshe, and the Torah is very critical of the fact that she spoke negatively, even though she was the older sister who had saved his life. She had the best intentions for Tzipporah because she felt she was being neglected as a wife. She goes to Aaron to tell Aaron, I think Moshe, it's not like she went and broadcasted it on Joburg Jewish Mummies or something, She went to Aaron and said, this is what's happening with Moshe, I think we need an intervention. And Hashem comes along over there and he says, you're out of line. Remember that story? Right? Hashem appears to them suddenly. It's the one time in the Torah it says the word pisoim. Hashem appears to them suddenly and he gives them a mapola like you cannot believe. What does Hashem say? Vayomer, Hashem says to them, Shimu no dovarai. Please listen to what I'm going to say. Are you kidding? Who's not going to listen when Hashem's speaking? What do you mean? Shimu no. Please listen to what I'm going to say. Says the Mishnah, well, at least the first one of the Mishnah tell us, this is how we know not to interrupt a person in a heated conversation. Because Aaron and Miriam, obviously, the minute Hashem comes and starts to effectively put them in their place, obviously they're going to feel defensive. And when a person feels defensive, which is the nature of debate, that's when you want to cut into what the other person is saying. Yeah, but you haven't heard my side of the story. So Hashem gives us the template and he says, Shimu no dvarai, let me finish what I'm saying, and then you can respond. In the modern world, we call this active listening. Because unfortunately, what happens, forget about debates, what happens all too often when people have regular conversation, especially conversations between people who are close to each other, maybe the best example of this is married couples, is we don't actually listen to what the other person is saying. Hanichnas atoich divrei chavero doesn't only mean that you say words that interrupt what the other person is saying. Hanichnas atoich divrei chavero means you already start to nichnas, right? You already start to enter, you start to trespass on what the person is saying in your head. Oh, they start saying that sentence in your head, you already start to finish that sentence for them. You know what they say? That's the difference between an engaged couple and a couple who's been married for a number of decades. You know the difference. So engaged couples, they're all googly-eyed and they tell everybody, it's so amazing, we're so connected. He just finishes my sentences for me. And then you forward like 20 years later, have the same couple and the person says, it's so irritating. He never allows me to finish a sentence. Right? Same thing. So nichnas atoich divrei chavero doesn't necessarily only mean that you say words that interrupt what the other person is saying, but in your head, you start to preempt what they're going to say or what they mean by what they're going to say. So a chacham is wise enough to recognize that when you are in a conversation, the whole power of the conversation is the capacity to listen right until the person has presented everything that they have to say without judgment. So the golem, remember, each one is going to be the opposite, right? The golem doesn't necessarily mean somebody can't keep their mouth shut and somebody who just talks right over somebody else. The golem is the unfinished product. This person they're on the path, but they're not quite there yet. So the golem is nichnas atoich divrei chaveroi mentally. The golem is a person who is already a step ahead of the conversation in their own head, in their own mind. Now that's a hard one, right? That's a difficult one to overcome, especially with the people who we think we know so well. So we know what they mean and we know what they're saying. I mean, we know where they're going with this, and we've seen this rodeo. So it's a huge challenge. Suddenly you realize the golem is not an idiot. The golem is not an amaoretz. The golem is not a bur. The golem is a work in progress, as many of us are, who's still trying to reach the point where we can actually listen without bias to actually hear what somebody has to say. So then the conversation continues, and a big part of a conversation, maybe one of the most difficult times within a conversation, is where you have to respond. So we've told the person, hold off, don't respond too soon, right? Don't get involved prematurely. Fine. So the person has that self-control, and they don't nichnas divrei chavera, they don't ride roughshod over the other person who's speaking. Now it's time to respond. What's the next thing it tells us? Ve'einoi nival lehashiv. The chacham does not rush to respond. What's the opposite of rushing to respond? Is they stop to think. Contextualize, contemplate. 1 second. What's the best thing to say? How should it be said? Should I say this at all? Now, if you think in the context of debate, which is the most extreme version of conversation that we're looking at, it's very difficult to do this successfully. Actually, not to rush. Why does a person rush to answer? What's the reason? What motivates a person to give an answer quickly? There are a whole bunch of things. Number one, the person needs to prove that they're a chacham. Remember, we're talking about a chacham, but then you think I have to consult. You think I have to think about this. No, I know these things. I have the answer. That's why I'm so strong in my view, because I've got the answer. So, Eino niva lo hashiv means that the person is, again, goes back to the point of humility. The person is humble enough to say, just because I think I know what I should answer doesn't mean that I can't stop, reflect, contextualize, and then present. And the source of this part of the Mishnah actually comes from the story of Eov. Remember, Eov had a really rough life and all kinds of bad things happened to him. And he goes to his friends for counsel. Now, we all know what that's like, right? We know somebody who's going through a really rough time and they come to us and they ask a question like, why do I have no muzzle? Why do these things always happen to me? We go to Chas v'Shalom to a Shiva house. And the person is saying, why did they have to go so soon? Or why did they have to suffer so much? So what do? We feel immediately that there's this tremendous responsibility to have to respond. We have to say something. They've just asked us a question, and it's a question that's painful for them. We have to respond. And when we do, very often what comes out turns out not to be appropriate. Right? At least they're not suffering anymore. You know? Or at least they didn't suffer. or whatever the things are that people say. Because nivhal lehashiv, we feel pressure. When it's time to respond, that's when we feel pressure. Our child comes home and says, that's it. I'm not keeping Shabbos anymore. God forbid, right? So what do you say? Nivhal lehashiv, all right, we've got to sort this out. This is my house, and as long as you're under my roof, you're going to behave. That's how we respond, right? Or little child, turns around to a parent and says, I hate you. As kids say. Nivhal lehashiv, you don't hate me, you're just saying it, right? So, ein nivhal lechochma, the wisdom is, ein nivhal lehashiv. It doesn't matter how emotive the circumstances are, or how much pressure we feel in the moment to have to supply an answer, we don't fall into that trap. And we don't just rush because of the emotional circumstances to have to satisfy an answer. Okay, we'll take time. So the friends, Eov comes to the friend and says, why is my life so difficult? They say, well, think about it, we'll come back to you. That's basically what they say. So give us some time. You know, we're your friends, we love you, we care about you. We're not going to blurt out an answer just because you're going through a crisis right now.
Is that why at a Shiva house you're not supposed to talk?
Well, it doesn't say you're not supposed to talk. It's you're supposed to wait to hear, right? They're supposed to speak first. Yeah. Correct. So in a Shiva house, the mourners are supposed to speak first. And really, psychologically, what that's supposed to represent is they should set the tone for where the conversation should go. Because unfortunately, what happens in a Shiva house a lot of the time is there's a great deal of discomfort. We come in, we don't know what to say, and then nobody's talking, so you feel like you have to make conversation. That's part of this whole concept. Nivhal lehashiv. You know, we feel the pressure to be able to respond. And sometimes the best response is, okay, so let's wait. So again, a goylem is now not somebody who's some kind of a village idiot. The goylem is somebody who hasn't mastered this yet. They're a work in progress. They still have that natural tendency of having to respond when something happens, right? That's probably part of the human experience for most of us. Okay? All right.
Isn't nivhal scared or frightened?
Well, it means like being in a frenzy. Right? We actually have it in the Megillah as well, seeing it's Erev Purim. We'll throw in all the Purim references we can find. So we have it in the Megillah. Where do we have it in the Megillah? Anybody know? We have it when Haman comes home after having led Mordechai around town, you know, the whole thing. This is what the king does to the man he wishes to honor. And then, of course, on top of all of that, he gets dumped with the garbage from his daughter who thinks that it's Mordechai. He comes smelling to high heaven. And what happens? All he wants, I'm sure, is just to put his feet up and, you know, I don't know, how do men deal with crisis? You know, he probably just doesn't want to talk to anybody, wants to sulk for a few hours. And what does the Megillah say? The next thing, the royal representatives are at his door to take him to the feast with Esther. And he doesn't want to go, he wants to take a shower first, at least. Vayavhilu lehavias Haman. They create chaos. No! Let's go. So that's the word behala, which is, right? In a nivhal, it means the person's like in this frenzied kind of state. Okay, so now you're not frenzied and you know how to respond. So how, in fact, do you respond? So the first thing you have to know, ironically, I'm saying it that way, is v'oimer al rishoin rishoin ve'al achroin achroin. That when you respond in a priority order, not necessarily chronological order, but a priority order. In other words, you know what things to address first and what things can wait. We learn this from Moshe and Hashem. When Moshe is at the burning bush, he has two questions for Hashem. Question number 1 is, who am I to speak to Paroi? Question number 2 is, and will he let the Jews out? So what does Hashem say to him? I will be with you. That's the answer to your question, who are you to speak to Paro? You can't do it on your own. I will be with you. And then your question, how will they go out of Mitzrayim? So he says, because I have a plan. The plan is that they'll come to serve me on this mountain. So there's an objective, and that's how you know that they're going to get out of Mitzrayim. So from here we learn that you answer al rishon v'al-achron achron. In other words, wisdom is not only to respond to something in chronological order, but in the correct priorities. In that case, it was purely chronological. But very often, the person who's asking the question doesn't necessarily get the priority. So they'll ask a first question, and then they'll ask a second question, and you think in order to be a chacham, you have to answer the first question first. Actually, the chacham is to know which is the first question. In other words, which is the question that lies at the core of the whole conversation. Guess what? Sometimes they haven't even asked that question. So therefore, to answer our rishon, to be able to answer things in the right order, sometimes you have to dig deep and ask yourself, so why did they ask this question? That's what you've got to ask. Whereas a golem says, this is the question, let's address the question. Right? Actually, I think we skipped Shoel Kinyan and Meshiv Kalocha. Anyway, we'll come to that one next. So what's our rishon? It's ironic, right? Our rishon's got to go in the right order. So our rishon, what does it mean? Sometimes you have to know where the question is coming from. Famous story where this, I can't remember exactly who the Rav was at the time. It could have been the Noda B'Yehuda, I don't remember. And somebody came to ask a question, if you're allowed to have, instead of 4 cups of wine at the Seder, they were having difficulty being able to afford wine. So, but they didn't want to say that. So the shaila was, if you don't have wine, could you do the 4 cups of milk? So famously, he understood it's got nothing to do with milk. It's got to do with not having money. Because if you're having milk, you obviously don't have meat at the Seder. So he understood what the priority of the question. Al rishon. What's the primary push behind this question? Now, one of the great things about being a chacham, and I think we'll all acknowledge in our own lives, that there are people out there who are real chachamim. Hopefully, they're also our rabbanim. A real chacham knows that you don't answer a question, you answer a person. Al rishon. First, you got to know who you're dealing with, and where they're coming from, and what their reality is. And then you could speak, the so to speak, superficialities of the pragmatism of it. So in other words, you could have 2 people who approach the same Rav with the same shaila at the same time, and they'll get 2 different answers. Because that's what it means to know al rishon. You've got to know first and foremost, who is this person? What are their circumstances? What is their Judaism? Where is their Judaism at? And then we could talk about, what you do with a particular issue that you have. So, the other night somebody said, it was quite funny because it's not a member of our community and somebody I haven't heard from for a long time. So they suddenly sent a question about, the husband. It's always the husband, right? He warmed up some milchik thing in the microwave, which was fleischig. It was like a whole thing. So what's the real question? The real question has nothing to do with the microwave. The real question is, where's your rabbi? Why are you asking me? That's the question. Now, Rishon, what happened? What happened in your community? Where's your connection, right? Sometimes you got to think, what is the primary source that drives a particular question? A golem says there's a question, we'll answer the question. A golem's not an amaretz. A golem's not a bur. A golem is just somebody who doesn't have that clarity or that maturity of being the ultimate chacham. In fact, one of the things that you'll see that runs as a theme right through this Mishnah, we said that a chacham is rooted in humility. A golem, unfortunately, is very often rooted in self-assuredness. So the golem is going to say, oh, you came to me to ask the question. Ooh, I must be a big deal now. You've come to ask me a question. The chacham says, why are you asking me the question? So it's 2 completely different perspectives. I recently saw something. I found it really, really fascinating. So this was a talk that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gave, I believe it was in the 1970s. Might have been the 60s, but I think it was in the 70s. And he's talking, now the reason I mention when it is just to be clear, that this is before the birth of the internet. And he's bemoaning the fact that you have people who take the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is obviously an abridged version of halacha. They read the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and then they paskin for other people how you're supposed to live Judaism. Whereas actually, in order to paskin, a person has to be very au fait with the Gemara, the Rambam, the other Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch, the various Acharonim. You have to know what you're talking about. So can you imagine, that was in the 70s. In today's world, it's no problem. The person will Google an answer, no problem. And then they'll tell you, this is the halacha. They have no idea of context. Al Rishon doesn't just mean you answer the first part of the question first. Al Rishon, you first got to get the first principles on which an answer is built, and only then, Achron, can you get to the later stage, which is you answer the question. So the Chacham would be able to say, which links in, as we'll see, to a little bit later in the Mishnah. I don't know if we'll get to that part today. I thought we'd squeeze the whole Mishnah in today, but it doesn't look like it. So, but the Chachma is the person to say, if I don't have the Rishon, if I don't have the foundation, then I can't address the Achron, which is the issue at hand. I've got to know that I'm thoroughly knowledgeable of the whole story, the whole scenario within Torah before I can respond.
Is this also the same as people believing, like what you hear after someone heard from someone else that this is the halacha, and also you as the listener don't do your research, if you know what I'm saying?
Okay, that's a fair point. That's a fair point.
This rabbi could do this, but the rabbi actually, I know, because my daughter, Rabbi Zaltzer teaches my daughter, and he says, you need to ask a rabbi, and don't say that I said something,
right.
I never said that, and everyone will say Rabbi Zaltzer says this,
right.
That's not what he said.
Right.
And people then go by what someone else said,
Exactly.
Broken
telephone.
For the listener to also take their part.
So I think what you're saying is a little bit more aligned with the next thing we're going to learn about in the Mishnah, which is Shoel Kinyan and Meshav Kalocha, which I don't think we'll manage today, but I think it's more aligned to that. What I do want to say, though, just because you've mentioned it, and I think it's very valuable, is how many people in today's day and age, I'm not talking about our kids, but how many people in today's day and age would wear hand-me-downs? You know? I was like, okay, there we go. Wrong generation. Right? So, hand-me-ups, yeah, exactly. But when it comes to halacha, we're quite happy with hand-me-downs. I heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from that rabbi. And I could tell you from personal experience of being the rabbi sometimes quoted with things that I never said. It's a dangerous game, right? But that's not exactly this point of al rishon v'al achron achron. Well, not sometimes. It's normal for people to hear what they want to hear, right? So let's go back. Nichnas atoich divrei chaveroi is exactly that. Nichnas atoich divrei chaveroi. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you verbally interrupt when the other person is speaking. It means that you mentally interrupt when the other person is speaking. And exactly that's where people hear what they want to hear. And that's why my favorite thing is where you speak, and I used to think it was a joke, and then I saw it actually happens in real life. And that is where you have a couple who walks out of marriage counseling, and as they walk out of the door, they both turn to each other and say, you see? Because you hear what you want to hear, ultimately, right? There's a famous mashal of the Dubna Magid, I'm sure you're familiar with, where the guy is walking in a forest and he sees all these trees with targets and arrows in the bullseye. And he's so blown away by it, and he says, I've got to find the archer who has such precision. Like, this is amazing. So he starts looking, eventually he finds a guy with his bow and arrow and his paint. And he says to him, where did you learn such incredible skill that you can always hit the target perfectly? He says, it's simple. I shoot the arrow and then I paint the target around the arrow. And that's what people do, right? So we shoot the arrow, meaning to say we decide what it is that we'd like to hear, and then we shop around until we find the old joke that they used to have in the days before the internet. I don't know if you know this, but before the internet, the joke in the frum world was the dial a heter hotline. Because in those days, it wasn't such a big thing here in South Africa, but in America it was a huge thing. It was dial a shiur and dial a halacha and dial a this, like all these things with these pre-recorded messages. So the joke was that they're going to start a dial a heter. So basically you phone the thing and it says, if you would like this heter, dial 1. If you'd like that opinion, dial 2. So that's what people do. So al rishon v'al achron means that the person knows how to create the right set of priorities, not only in terms of addressing a question, but even just in terms of, knowing how to look at things. Our Rishon, we're going to know what are first priorities in our Judaism. And then about Achron, then we can get into the details. Unfortunately, sometimes we get so caught up in the details, we forget about the core principles of what Judaism is actually all about. So it might be one of the most challenging things, right, is to have that clarity at all times. What is Rishon and what is Achron? What comes first and what follows afterwards? The example that I once heard Rabbi Yossi Jacobson give is the person who's at a wedding, and he's not 100% sure that he trusts the hashgacha at the wedding. So they bring him a salad, and there's lettuce in the salad. He's got to check the lettuce, because he doesn't trust the hashgacha, so he's got to check the lettuce. The only problem is, in a wedding, the lighting is not very good lighting. So the only place that there's good lighting is the video guy has his spotlight on the main table. So there the guy goes with his letters, standing in front of the video thing, in front of the main table, checking his letters. Right? That's where you mix up the Rishon and the Achron. Rishon is Simchas Chosen Vekala, Avas Yisrael, things like that, like minor things of Judaism, and you don't have to have lettuce.
You don't have to eat the salad.
You don't have to eat the salad.
And kibbut people don't.
So there you go.
Salads.
I don't know about that.